Welcome, dear students, and today we are going to study about what all happened during the Tunisian uprising, A, and B, what happened after the Tunisian uprising, because whatever is happening right now in Tunisia is something which is a matter of concern. There is a term called as, in fact, there are two terms. One is hybrid democracy that we are going to discuss in this class, what it means. And the second is what is a self coup. We have heard about constitutional coups, we have heard about military coups, but what is a self coup? So we are going to study about that. So let us start with today's class and get a knowledge base on what exactly happened in the Tunisian uprising and what are the ramifications of it for the greater public. If there is a concept of greater good at all, and even though a lot of scholars and critics have stated that when you compare Arab uprising in other countries like Egypt and Libya and Bahrain and um, Syria, Tunisia was comparatively the successful model, but few repercussions have happened. It is also happening as we speak right now, and I will tell you the context of it. So it's up to you to decide that how the ramifications have shaped themselves. But one thing which a lot of critiques of revolutions have questioned, that often when revolutionaries go ahead with an uprising, a demonstration, or remonstration, they know that what they want to replace, right? They know what they're fighting against, but they don't know what they want to replace it with. So that often leads to a certain kind of counter revolution or a certain kind of structural bias within the system of revolution. So let us start. As you know, that Jasmine Revolution was a term which was used for the uprisings in um, Tunisia. Now, understand that the terminology of, or the etymology, that is the origin of the word, um, the terminology of uprisings were endowed by the Western scholars, or it was something which was indigenous that the Tunisians themselves called it as. That's always a question of debate because the Tunisians called it the Sidi Bouzid revolt, because here is where Muhammad Bouazizi set himself on fire, and the initial protest had started on 17th, 18th of December 2010. But the Western media started dubbing it as Jasmine Revolution or Jasmine Spring. Um, the term Jasmine, as it was also accepted by Ben Ali, who was the then president, was because it reflected, apart from the fact that jasmine is a national flower of Tunisia, it was also reflecting a bloodless coup, a kind of um, terminology that he was often infatuated with. The name Jasmine Revolution, where did it originate from, has two to three different kinds of narratives. The first narrative is that it was coined by an American journalist called as Andy Carwin, but it was not widely accepted in Tunisia itself. Understand that there's also the politics of language. In Tunisia, the three spoken languages mostly are Arabic, French, and then English, and they also have the indigenous Berber language. Uh, the term Jasmine Spring or Jasmine Revolution, as we talked about, was a certain kind of terminology which was integrated from above in order to have a certain kind of understanding of what is happening. Um there was another Tunisian philosopher, Yusuf Sadiq, who said that this term is very inappropriate because when the French Revolution started in 1789, the kind of bloodshed, the kind of um, acrimony, the kind of manslaughter that took place, not only in 1789, but for the 30, 40 years that will come later after 1789 in the French Revolution, That would be a better term, it would be better to understand the uprising in that way. You had a person who set himself on fire and he died eventually out of it. It cannot be a bloodless revolution. In fact, it was as deep as the Bastille Day, which is celebrated on July the 14th in France. But there's another Tunisian journalist called as Ziad El Hani who used it in his blog, the term Jasmine Revolution, on 13th of January. And it spread, it went viral on Facebook and Twitter, specifically among the youth members in Tunisia, but not all of the demography of Tunisia. So there was a certain kind of those who were English educated or French educated, had access to social media, were able to use it and refer to it when they were trying to talk about the Tunisian uprising. At the same time, on 28th of November 2010, this is way before, like when Mohammad Bouazizi set himself on fire. It is 28th of November. Mohammad Bouazizi will set himself on fire on 17th or 18th of December. So almost like 20 days before, WikiLeaks, which was the platform curated by Julian Assange that had shot into limelight because of the US war crimes that were taking place in Iraq and Afghanistan. Um, WikiLeaks published on the platform, and it was published also by other newspapers, Western newspapers, this report, which was like Spain's El País, France's Le Monde, Germany's Der Spiegel, UK's The Guardian, United States, the New York Times. They also started publishing whatever WikiLeaks was publishing. And specifically, the first 220 out of the 2,51,287 documents that were confidential and leaked by WikiLeaks regarding Tunisia. And these documents revealed how corruption was widespread in the Tunisian regime. And several scholars believe that after this kind of revelation by WikiLeaks, which was also again published in the Western newspapers and not in the Tunisian newspapers. So the language which is used is Spanish, German, French, English, uh, also created a certain kind of narrative that there is a lot of corruption going on in the regime of Ben Ali. Did the entire Tunisian population know about it? That is a matter of debate. But WikiLeaks did publish these classified documents, which were very confidential. The second issue is that when we talk about Tunisia, most of the scholars only talk about Mohammad Bouazizi setting himself on fire. But there are many, many other protesters who also had to, uh, you know, suffer vulnerable positions and eventually let go of their life. They lost their lives. On 22nd of December, there was a protester, Lesin Naji, who, due to joblessness and hunger, electrocuted himself, literally electrocuted himself. The second protester was Ramzi El Aboudi, who also killed himself because of the financial difficulties which were arising. Again, the country's microcredit program, which was for, as we have MSMEs in India, that micro, small, and medium enterprises, and it is headed by um, the union ministries, that was not able to give any kind of financial support to uh, those who were in the informal sector. Ramzi was one of them. On 24th of December, Muhammad Ammari, because of his protest, was fatally shot in the chest by the police in Boisian. There were other protesters who were also injured, like Chowki Belhouzi El Hadri, who died on 30th of December. Police claimed that they shot the demonstrators in self-defense. That is how they encounter killing took place, and there was a quasi curfew. Quasi curfew is when it is a superficial, um, not written down or not legally implemented, constitutionally implemented, a curfew that was imposed in Tunis and other cities where the demonstrations had become very, very popular. So there are many, many protesters who lost their lives. Mohammad Bouazizi became the face of it. Now, then, after that, there was also a strike by lawyers on 6th of January. 95% of Tunisia's 8,000 lawyers went on strike, according to the chairperson of the National Bar Association. Um, there was a lot of, in most of the authoritarian regimes, there is a certain kind of tension that exists between the government and the judiciary. And the tension is very palpable. It is very difficult for the judiciary. It also happened in Egypt. So all these lawyers went out on strikes. And after them, even teachers and members of civil society went out on strike, and they started striking against the president, demanding the resignation of him. On 10th of January, the government announced that there will be an indefinite closure of all the schools and universities because a lot of students had started protesting also. Ben Ali, who had initially stated that he's again going to change the constitution so that his term is extended, um, tried to placate everyone by stating that no, I'm not going to, I would not continue after 2014 because of my age and I would give up and all of that. But the protesters were not ready to listen to all of that. At the same time, there is a recap that I want to give you that during the time of Bourguiba, there was no oppositional political parties that were permitted. But when Ben Ali came, at least as he started with giving more press freedom and letting the press have less censorship and they can write about the comments and stories from the opposition parties. Um, so Ben Ali tried to have a multi-party system, and multi-party elections for the first time took place in 1989. But they did not have, because any party needs funding and it needs resource mobilization, it needs people who are galvanized. So none of these parties that had emerged not legally had the same kind of funding or organizational maneuvering as RCD, which was the Democratic Constitutional Rally the Ben Ali party had. Now, your question will be that why are we saying in English Democratic Constitutional Rally and writing the acronym RCD? It's because the acronym is based on the French interpretation. What Democratic Constitutional Rally is the English terminology for it. RCD would mean the French terminology for it. That's why the acronym RCD is used. It was Ben Ali's party, and often he did not have any kind of opposition member standing for the post of president. There were laws which were against political parties on the basis of ethnicity, religion, language, and region. So, Ennahda, which was the Islamist party, in Arabic, Ennahda means the Renaissance. It was not granted the legal status, and most of them who were from the Islamist Ennahda party were either jailed or they had to go underground or they were exiled from the country. But Ennahda, just like Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, um, was a political party that used to love working at the grassroots level, like for example, working for the empowerment of people, having more schools, hospitals, better roads, talking about education. But because they were Islamist in nature, Ennahda was not given the legal status even during the time of Ben Ali. On 14th of January, Ben Ali dissolved his government and he declares a state of emergency. Even then, during the wee hours, he felt as if he could continue. The official reason that he gave, as any dictator gives during the time of emergency, that it is to combat internal tension and to um, save people and their property. People were not allowed to gather in groups more than three people. If they gathered, they could be arrested or they could be shot. He also tried to call for an election so that the demonstrations will be diffused and he will not be able to, he would continue. France 24, the French news platform, reported meanwhile that the military took control of the airport and also closed the country's airspace. So no other um, flight could operate through the airspace of Tunisia. But as things didn't go according to Ben Ali's plan, he had to flee and he fled thinking he will go to Malta in Italy under the protection of Libya, which is Gaddafi's protection, who was the president then of Libya. When his aircraft eventually landed in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, because France, he also wanted to go to France, but France rejected. Saudi Arabia gave him the asylum, stating that, okay, these are exceptional circumstances, though Saudi Arabia was heavily criticized at that point of time, that how can you give asylum to Ben Ali? But Saudi Arabia stated that they will give asylum under this exceptional circumstance if Ben Ali remains out of politics. And he accepted these terms and conditions. And the kind of asylum which I'm giving the hint of is a very elite life that was waiting for him in Saudi Arabia with, like all the lavishness that he could get. Meanwhile, Ghanouchi, who was made the president for few days, had to hand over the position to the parliamentary speaker, Fuad Mebaza, and Ghanouchi returned to his position as the prime minister. It was stated, the judiciary stated that, and the Constitutional Council of Tunisia stated that Ghanouchi was not the right person, he did not have the right power under the Article 57 of the current constitution to have the presidentship. Mebaza, who was the Speaker of the Parliament, was given 60 days to organize new elections. And Mebaza stated, the person on the right, he stated that it is the best interest of the country if they form a national unity government, having a kind of coalition of all the parties which have that kind of resource mobilization at that point of time. The first thing that was done was to have every member of RCD out from the parliament. Everyone who was a politician or a member of the parliament who represented Ben Ali's party was taken out, according to the bill which was passed. The bill also endowed Mebaza, who was the acting president at that point of time, to ratify international human rights treaties with um, his own accord without taking the consent of the parliament, um, so that Tunisia is able to have, follow the international jurisprudence on abuses of human rights that have taken place, on protection, and the sudden enforced disappearances of people, the kind of massive executions and human rights abuses and encounter killings that had been taken by the police under the context of the international law. So he did it on his own accord by the bill. Then Mebaza appointed Beji Qaid SABC as the prime minister when Ghanouchi finally had to resign. Although now the cabinet, which is the inner circle of the government, the RCD members of the previous party were out. But demonstrations continued because they believed that the appointment of SMC was also not democratic, and protesters said that how can suddenly, a prime minister be appointed? If we are fighting for democracy, it has to be done within the democratic process and not by the whim and fancy of the president. Meanwhile, there was a refugee crisis that emerged. Almost 4,000 Tunisian refugees. They fled from Tunisia, crossing the Mediterranean, going to an island of Lampedusa, which is of Italy. It's a very small island, as you can see here. If it is, this is Tunisia. Just look here. This is Tunisia, and this is Lampedusa, a very small island. Very, very small island, Italian island. Malta is the other island where Ben Ali wanted to go, but he was not given the permission. So, crossing the Mediterranean, a lot of Tunisians went over to this small island. So, the Italian authorities had to declare a state of emergency because it was a certain refugee crisis that suddenly was emerging. Italian Interior Minister Roberto Maroni, he also accused the European Union of not doing enough to curb this kind of illegal immigration that was taking place. He said the Tunisian system was collapsing, and the Tunisian Foreign Ministry now has to intervene. But this was just the starting of the refugee crisis, which continues till today. From all these conflict-rid states where Arab uprising took place, a lot of people had to fly away, not fly, but flee away from their territory, crossing the Mediterranean in boats and ships, and often losing their lives when the boats get shipwrecked or there's no guarantee. Also, it created a black market for, okay, you want to get out of Tunisia or Libya or Syria, so you need to have certain amount of gold or money so that the ships will take you. So it was expensive. Not everyone was able to afford it. And once the refugees entered Europe, they could enter the Europe, any European country, eventually crossing the English Channel and even going to UK. So there was a certain kind of refugee crisis um, that started over immediately as soon as Ben Ali had resigned. So as you see, this was Lampedusa was closest for the Tunisians to go. Then was Malta, then Italy, and others. On October 2014, Tunisia was finally able to hold its first elections, and a new constitution was then created. The man who was one of the pivotal figures in creating this constitution in 2014 is currently the president of Tunisia. We'll talk about him. Um, but now, right now, he's trying to override the same constitution and go against it. Till 2021, it was stated that Tunisia was the only democracy in North Africa where democratic elections were taking place. But now the Democracy Index classifies it as a hybrid regime. Now, what is a hybrid regime? What is the meaning of this term, hybrid regime? Hybrid matlab mixture. Regimes where you have reign of control, which is not democratic in nature. So these are nations which have regular electoral frauds. On the paper, there are elections, but they are rigged and they don't have free democracies. And the government applies a lot of pressure on the political opposition. The judiciary is not independent. The corruption is widespread. There's a lot of harassment on the media and a certain kind of flawed democracy with a very, very underdeveloped form of political pluralism. People don't really vote in the elections, and the level of governance is very authoritarian and dogmatic in its concern and functioning instead of a democratic representation. What is the condition of Tunisia today? On paper, Tunisia is a representative democracy and a republic. It has a president who serves as the head of the state. It has a prime minister who heads the government. It had a unicameral, just one house in the parliament, and a civil law court system. Now, what is civil law? So, normally in most of these countries, like Saudi Arabia and others, they have the Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic law called as Sharia law. Now, Sharia law is again very debatable. The definition is not um, a one line definition of what Sharia is. Sharia law is very context driven, depending which country is applying it and what are the codes of conducts which will be followed. So, the same Sharia law, the Islamic law, which will be followed in Pakistan or maybe in Saudi, will be different from the other counterparts. Uh, so, instead, Tunisia adopted the civil law court system and not the Sharia jurisprudence. The Constitution of Tunisia, which was adopted on 26th of January 2014, guaranteed the rights for women and the states that the president religion shall be Islam. So, one thing which was considered to be empowering for by a lot of scholars when democratic elections started taking place in Tunisia was the amount of women representation in the parliament that had started. Though a lot of scholars say that it was just a facade and it was just lip service which was given and did not have any iota of literal women empowerment in Tunisia. But in comparison to all the Arab states, at least the amount of representation for women in Tunisia is comparatively more when you compare with other. The number of legalized political parties in Tunisia also grew after the revolution. Currently, there are 100 legal parties, which several of them which existed but not with the same kind of funding or organizational maneuvering in the previous regimes. During the rule of Ben Ali, there were only three opposition parties, the PDP, FDTL, and Tajdeed. Ennahda was not allowed. Ennahda got legal representation after the Tunisian uprising. For the condition of the Tunisian women, um, it's very rare for the Arab world to hold more than 20% of seats, specifically for women, in the bicameral parliament. Now, when I am using the term bicameral parliament, there are two reasons for it. The first is that before the uprising, it was a bicameral parliament. After the uprising, it became a unicameral. And now, with the current president who has dissolved the parliament and aims to again have a bicameral parliament right now. In 2011, the Constituent Assembly had women representation of 24 to 31%, which is a high number if you compare the numbers in all the other Arab states. Why was the condition for Tunisian women different from when you compare it with the other Arab states? So, just after independence in 1956, there was a code of personal status that was adopted, which gave women full legal status, that they can legally run their own business, they can have their bank accounts, they can seek passports in the country. Polygamy was outlawed, illegal in Tunisia, and a husband cannot unilaterally go ahead and divorce the wife according to his whim and fancy. That was not allowed in Tunisia. There was a stress given to women's education. So these were reasons why, even just after getting independent, the condition of Tunisian women was comparatively better when you compare it with the other contemporaries. Now, here comes the politics, which is happening right now as we speak. The current president, Kaise Saed, as you can see on my right, he was born on 22nd of February 1958. By profession, he was a jurist, and he was a law professor also. He worked in politics. He became the president in 2019 October. He is the eighth president of Tunisia. So the first was Bourguiba, then Ben Ali, then you had the transition government and elections on and on and on. And Kaise Saed becomes the president. Now, just after he becomes the president in January 2021, massive protests begin because there was police abuse and brutality, economic hardship, and along with that, the COVID pandemic. So the amount of protests and the number of protests against him, the cost of living in Tunisia for a normal is the wrong word, for an average human being became very expensive. The price of bread, medicines, travel started um, becoming very expensive in Tunisia. So what does Said do? On to 25th of July 2021, he goes ahead and dismisses the entire parliament. Dissolves the parliament. He was a person who was involved in the 2014 making of the constitution. And he is the person who dissolves the parliament. He also dismisses the Prime Minister Hisham Mechiki, and this is called as a self coup. What is a self coup? When in a democracy or in any kind of regime, you become the head of the state through legal means, but you continue then through illegal means. After that, he started dismissing a lot of judiciary members and arresting a lot of politicians. And then he also gave a decree that he's going to um, create a new constitution, which is going to be according to his protocol. He was successful in passing this new constitutional. Very few number of people came and voted, but it was very dictatorial in nature. It is also called as a constitutional coup because since he came to power, he suspended the parliament, dissolved the government, fired the judges, acting just as a dictator, or one can say that the history is repeating itself in Tunisia for what the Tunisians had tried to fight against. On 25th of May 2022, the decree that he issued stated that the constitution will be changed. He has given few controversial statements also, like for example stating that homosexuality exists, but a lot of foreign intervention spreads homosexuality. It is not natural. When it came to the power symmetry between a husband and wife and the property changes from one generation to another for women, he clearly stated that we'll follow the Quran. Quran has been very clear on his interpretation of Quran and what is the status of women, which was kind of a shock for a lot of Tunisian women politicians. The number of women in the parliament also started, he had started firing or dismissing them of their duties. Today, in the news, it was reported that Kaise Saed did not new parliament that has formed, he has not allowed any kind of foreign press to enter Tunisia and to report about it. And it just happened this week. And by 2022 constitution, the bicameral legislature has been reinstated. The lower house, which is called as the Assembly of the People's Representative, is like your Lok Sabha, where a kind of legislation or bill will be started, will be introduced. At least 10 members have to ratify it. They have to take the financial budgetary concern about it. The members of this house will be for 5 years. The upper chamber, called as the National Assembly of Regions and Districts, it has the power to strip the immunity from legislators. So everyone in the lower house, the power can be taken away. Saied has not mentioned what kind of legislative power would the upper house have more, and what kind of new fundamental rights or statutes will be implemented by him. After that, he has pursued a massive crackdown on all the opponents. Though he came from the Social Conservative Party, he was an independent candidate, and neither party had supported him. But now he has carried out a massive crackdown on all the opponents and opponent parties which were functioning legally in Tunisia. In February 2023, last month, the police raided the home of Noruddin Biri, who was a popular member of the largest opposition party, Ennahda, which also had played a role in bringing Saied to power, and the police arrested him. At the same time, a lot of activists, lawyers, and journalists have been targeted in Tunisia. Media Watchdog Committee to Protect Journalists has openly condemned Tunisian authorities because the opening session of the parliament, which took place this week, none of the independent or foreign journalists were allowed to come to Tunisia. They did not get the visas, they could not. Committee to Protect Journalists called this move as an attack on media freedom and stating that there will be no fair coverage of the event. Kaise Saed is quite reluctant of the foreign media or the NGOs with foreign funding in Tunisia or any kind of foreign intervention. That is why one of the reasons why Democracy Index has called Tunisia now as a hybrid regime. So the questions that we have to ask from this particular narrative that we studied, the first question is that how would a Tunisian feel about it? Said was born after Tunisia became independent. He lived through the presidencies of Bourguiba and Ben Ali and the other transitions after the Arab Uprising in Tunisia. When he came to power, the one section that he really appealed to was the Tunisian youth. And now he is undoing whatever he promised. But then again, how do I get to know about it? My narrative of this is from the Western sources, Committee to Protect Journalists, and other Western newspapers. It is not an empirical study which I have done by going to Tunisia and talking with Tunisians. So it can be that the narrative is flawed, or it is the one which the West needs right now. How is the constitution different from the 2014 and the previous ones? Needs a detailed study. But all said and done, if all of this is true, then the demographic dividend of the youth, the labor class, which was suffering because of the informal economy and the lack of support programs and welfare schemes by the government, is now again failed and has failed because this was not the future they wanted. They wanted a certain kind of catharsis and healing from the Arab bitterness that was imposed, not a facade with a different face, creating the same kind of hegemony of power. But yes, Tunisia is not in a civil war like other countries where the Arab uprising took place, unfortunately, were engulfed with. Today's lecture will make you now, if you study about Tunisia, will at least give you a certain kind of narrative, and you will be able to understand what exactly is happening and what is the history of it. And in the previous lecture, we discussed about the entire, since independence, the history of Tunisia. So it will be easier for you to now understand what is happening in Tunisian politics. In the next class, we'll start with the short history of Egypt and discuss about what happened and how it happened and what are the ramifications of it. So today's class is still here.